Hello from the Heartland. My name is Jenna, and this is Smarter News. News when it matters and why it matters. Our Smarter series features unique people who help us think and live smarter. Well, today is my favorite type of news story because it allows us to give attention to a headline that's not really getting the attention that it potentially deserves. And it's also going to give us an opportunity to learn something new about a topic that probably very few of us know a lot about. So here's a little background. We've focused recently, and rightfully so, on the Russian war on Ukraine. But most of the coverage that we've been reporting on has been focused on what's happening inside Ukraine, on the land. But today, what we're going to do is we're going to focus on the coastline and the strategic waters around Ukraine and Russia. Did you know that dozens of cargo ships, more than 1,000 crew members from around the world, have actually been trapped because of this war that's ongoing? In fact, the International Chamber of Shipping recently said about these waters, and this is a quote, multiple ships have been hit by munitions, seafarers have been killed and injured, and seafarers of all nationalities are trapped on ships berthed in the ports. So bottom line here, it's not just about the land. It's not just about Ukrainians and Russians. If we're actually going to cover this story more completely, this is also about what's happening on the water and the potential for this to impact not only shipping channels and crews and supply chain and the inflation that we've talked so much about. Yes, it has all the potential to impact that. And we're going to talk more about that. But I also am curious about what happens with these ships, about whether or not this could be part of an escalation that we should watch. We're always asking the question, well, what's going to happen next? What can actually make this conflict into a bigger conflict and draw in other countries from around the world? And so this is why I'm really interested in this topic. And we're lucky because our guest actually knows a lot about this, where we may not. We're going to be speaking with maritime historian and professor at Campbell University, Salvatore Mergliano. He's a former merchant marine as well, which I want to ask you a little bit about, Sal, because I've heard that term merchant marine, but I got to tell you, I don't really totally understand what is a merchant marine and how did you get involved in that?
Sure. So a merchant mariner is somebody who sails ships for a living. I mean, so just imagine an airline pilot, except we do it with ships. So, it was a career path for me. I've always grew up in New York. I used to go out with my dad fishing offshore, the southern shore of Long Island, and I hated fish. I don't eat fish to this day. I just never liked it. But what I loved was driving the boat, and we'd go about 50 miles offshore, and you would see the ships coming in and out of New York Harbor. And to me, that was great. I was like, that's what I wanted. I just wanted to get on a boat and go somewhere. And so that was my dream. And then that's what I wound up doing for 7 years.
Wow. So wait a minute. Do you eat fish? You just don't fish?
I don't fish, and I'm not crazy about fish. So I'm not a real big one. I think because I did it so much, I kind of got away from it.
So then how did you transition from actually sailing around the world to focusing more on history and becoming a professor on this topic?
Well, like many merchant mariners, I came down with a condition that prevented me from continuing my sailing career. I got married. It's kind of hard to have a kind of a married life and be at sea as much as it involves. But I was always interested in the history of it. I was really always enjoyed. I sailed during the first Persian Gulf War. And while I was there, I was really interested in how we got to where we were, that we were able to do that type of movement of cargo. It was amazing. I mean, I remember being on the docks in Saudi Arabia and seeing these ships coming in. It was just incredible. And so I always had a kind of passion for it. And I really just kind of dug into it. And actually, there's not a lot of people who do the research I do. So it's always a good thing when you do history to find a little niche. And that's kind of what I found.
Well, a couple of things on that. One, I'm 100% going to be using that joke in the future. I really thought there was a condition. I'm like, maybe there's something, inner ear issue that I should, did you get seasick? Nope. Just marriage. Okay.
Just marriage.
I needed that after a long week. Yeah, that's for sure. It certainly can feel like a condition sometimes. And you're right. When you see those huge cargo ships, and a lot of us are paying closer attention to cargo ships now more than ever, because we saw the images of the cargo ships being stuck off the West Coast, for example, not being able to come to port during these crazy supply chain issues that we've seen throughout the pandemic. So we've all had a better understanding of, man, these ships are really big. What they do is so important for the world economy, but also impacts me directly at home. And that's why earlier this week, I was reading an article in the Wall Street Journal on this topic where you were quoted saying what we're seeing now based on the events in Ukraine and how it's affecting shipping, maybe some of the most dramatic events in the industry in several decades. So Tell us why. Like what is happening off the coast, along the coast in Ukraine, and why does it matter?
Right. And I think it's also important too to put in the context. I mean, we've seen since the beginning of COVID a supply chain issue that has just pushed the system to its limits. You've had a whole series of events from as you mentioned the pileup of vessels off the port of LA Long Beach, which still exist. They're still there. Matter of fact, they're growing in other ports now, to the Ever Given going sideways in the canal. And what we've seen is really our ability to move cargo has been really under a lot of pressure recently from a whole series of events. But now we're adding a war, a conflict. Russia invades Ukraine, and most people, the Black Sea is not on everyone's radar. It's like a little cul-de-sac off the Mediterranean. Don't know that much about it. But in truth, if you look at Ukraine, for example, Ukraine's responsible for 10% of the world's grain exports. Russia's responsible for 9%. So you're talking about almost 1/5 of the world's food supply coming out of those two countries, largely those areas. I mean, Ukraine is like Kansas and Nebraska on steroids. It's just a huge flat area. I mean, the reason why you keep seeing tractors towing tanks out is because everyone's a farmer in Ukraine. It is the breadbasket for a good chunk of the world. And now all of a sudden you're seeing that food disrupted. I mean, even if tomorrow the war ends, one of the things that we're going to see is the inability for that food to come out because we've created this instability. This is food that doesn't come really to us so much, but to North Africa, to the Middle East, to Asia. And what's going to have to happen is food's going to have to replace that from somewhere, which means that we'll be selling more food. But we've got issues with our selling food because we can't get our exports out because of the constraints in our ports. And what this tends to mean is we're going to see higher food cost inflation. And that's really a key thing, Jen, is that we're really very interconnected, more so than ever before. And a lot of it is through oceanic trade.
That's so fascinating. I didn't know any of that about Ukraine and Russia, by the way. Everyone wants to talk about vodka related to Russia or oil, but this is grain is really, think about all the things that grain goes into. And as you mentioned, feeding a large portion of the world. So what do you know about the current situation for some of these large cargo ships that are along the coast? And I want to mention an asterisk. Obviously, it's very difficult to get information and to get accurate information. But can you sort of paint a picture from your understanding of what actually is going on in the water there?
Sure. So, I mean, even before the invasion happened back in February, Russia staged a huge naval exercise in the area. So already ships going in the area were sailing under increased risk. And so one of the things we saw early in February was insurance rates start to increase. So it was getting more expensive to operate in this area. And so right from the very beginning, we're seeing increased costs because that insurance gets passed on to the consumers. Ships were going in, but once Russia invaded Ukraine, the Ukrainians responded by mining their waters. They put underwater mines out. And so that effectively closed the ports right off the bat. Plus, you had the Russians had shifted large elements of their naval fleets from the Baltic, from the North Sea, through the Mediterranean into the Black Sea. So there's a massive Russian fleet that's sailing right now off the coast. And right at the very beginning, we saw several attacks on ships because in truth the Russians aren't very accurate in some things, and so they tend to just hit what's in front of them. So we saw some commercial vessels endangered. We've seen a ship in the port of Alavia, which was hit, a Bangladesh ship, which resulted in the death of a third assistant engineer on board and wounded much more of the crew. We saw the Russians take a Panamanian flagged vessel and use it as literally a human shield in the Gulf of Odessa as a buffer between them and the Ukrainians. That vessel either was struck by a mine or potentially a missile, and it was sunk. We've also seen attacks on other vessels, a Moldavian ship, a Panamanian ship, a Japanese-owned ship, a Turkish ship. So there have been attacks across the board. What this has resulted in is the area of northern Black Sea around the Gulf of Odessa has been closed. On the flip side, a lot of your readers and viewers will know there's a port called Mariupol, which has been held out by the Ukrainians for a long time. The reason the Russians are trying to get Mariupol so much is it's on the what's called the Sea of Azov, which is a kind of a big, huge kind of basin. And it cuts the Russians off from moving their cargo at sea. There's a city called Rostov. It's on the Don River. The Don River is the fifth largest river in Europe. And a lot of commerce comes down the Don River through the Sea of Azov and out into the Black Sea. Well, none of that cargo can move because as long as the Ukrainians hold Mariupol, they block up the Russian cargo. So we're seeing cargo not just stopped by the Ukrainians coming, or Ukrainian cargo coming out, stopped by the Russians, but the Ukrainians are stopping Russian cargo from coming out. So this is really a economic warfare we're seeing being waged by these two countries.
That's just unbelievable. I mean, there's so much I didn't realize was actually happening there. When you're talking about a ship that's flying under a flag, like the Panamanian ship, for example, or the Turkish ship, is that does that ship represent the country? Meaning, is that like drawing Panama into the conflict? Or in the case of a Turkish ship, Turkey is a NATO member. So I'm just wondering, we're all asking, how do more countries get involved? If a ship is hit, is that like a traveling embassy, for lack of a better explanation or example, like
In the
targeting
past,
another country?
no, in the past that had been when you attacked, an American flag ship, you're attacking America. So, that's traditionally been it. But for example, the ship that was sunk was flying a Panamanian flag, but it's owned by Estonia, and Estonia is a NATO nation. And so, is that an attack on NATO then? And there's ambiguity about that. I mean, do you identify the ownership of the vessel, or do you identify the registry? Since the end of World War II, we've had this proliferation of registries, these nations that allow you to register a ship for very low cost. And so, the three largest shipping, countries by flag are Panama, Liberia, and the Marshall Islands. Not exactly what we tend to think of when we think of ocean shipping. But when you look at the ownership, it's Turkish, it's Japanese, it's Estonian, and it creates an ambiguity. And same thing with the crews on board, because a lot of these crews come from different countries. I'll give you an example. 15% of the world's mariners are Russians and Ukrainians, and a lot of them on a same ship. Ukrainians and Russians sail typically together all the time. And there's a big issue right now about the Ukrainians wanting to get off the ships and head home. What happens when you lose 5% of the world's sailors all of a sudden? That could stop ships immediately. There was just a report out that ships coming into Russian ports with Ukrainian crews, there's an order out for those Ukrainian crews to report to shore to the immigration office. If I'm a Ukrainian, do I really want to sail into a Russian port? That's going to divert vessels. And so this ambiguity in international shipping has been growing for a long time, and it makes it more complicated when attacks. It also makes it easier for people to attack these vessels because there's not retaliation. You can hit a vessel and not really worry about it as much.
What do you think with the ambiguity? What do you think is the right way to look at it, Sal?
I think we've gone away from the idea of flying the flag, and that's where this ship belongs. I think ownership plays a really big part in this now. But even with ownership, it's really hard at times because these ships are owned by corporations that are sometimes shells, and so it's really difficult at times to track it down. The International Maritime Organization, which is the subset of the United Nations that oversees shipping, just had an extraordinary session yesterday to talk about this issue, and they came out with a list of recommendations and hopes that they want to see come out of it, but they're really limited in their power. They don't have a lot of oversight when it comes to something like this. They really want to create, what they call a blue highway to allow the ships and mariners to come out of the area and evacuate. But the problem is the Black Sea is a really narrow sea area. You don't have NATO up on the Black Sea very much. You've got a couple of NATO nations up there, but largely they've allowed the Russians to basically control the northern Black Sea, and they're operating really without any checks or balances on them. The Ukrainians are really restricted in what they can do.
Based on your knowledge of history, what do you think the risk is that an attack on one of these large ships, let's say that they're trying to leave the area? It doesn't look like that's the case right now. We'll talk about it in a moment. But what has history taught us about how conflict at sea can draw different countries into conflict?
Well, I mean, you have the case when you attack a warship, for example, that can be the cause for war. You sink the Maine in Havana Harbor, you go to war with Spain, you shoot at an American destroyer off the coast of Vietnam, you get the Tonkin Gulf resolution. But commercial ships don't operate in that same way. I mean, we've seen American ships sunk by the Germans prior to World War I and World War II, and it didn't exactly trigger war until enough of them were sunk or something larger happened. And that's unfortunately the plight of merchant mariners in many ways. They tend to be cannon fodder in a lot of this. They're expendable. They're not seen to be as big of an issue. And it's commercial too. And again, we get into this idea where these ships are now controlled by these international corporations. So it's not exactly clear where the ownership is. And again, we're seeing right now shipping companies playing an inordinate role in this conflict that we didn't think they would play to begin with.
And how so?
Well, we're seeing shipping companies, for example, self-sanctioning Russia, for example. We were talking a lot about sanctions. You heard the president come out and sanction against the purchase of Russian oil, but now you have companies. Now we've seen companies do this, McDonald's, Starbucks. They'll shut down their businesses within Russia. But when you start talking about shipping companies, when you start talking about the large container companies, there are 9 companies that control 85% of the world's container trade. I mean, they are massive in 3 large alliances. And when companies like Maersk, Mediterranean Shipping Company, Hauppauge, CMA CGM, and these big companies sit there and say, you know what, we're not sailing to Russia anymore, that's going to have a significant impact in their trade. Even though Russia only represented about 3% of the world container trade, it's happening all at once. And now all of a sudden, a country is going to be sanctioned. Remember, the sanctions were targeting Putin and the oligarchs. We're going to get their yachts, we'll get their mansions, their Gulf Streams. This is going to hit the Russian people right where they live. They're not going to have the goods coming in they need. Their financial services are being disabled, and the ruble has just plummeted off a cliff. And this is going to be catastrophic economically to the Russians. But this is a power that we haven't really, it's usually reserved for governments, not for corporations. And so it's a much different area.
That's so interesting. So yes, all the focus is on policy coming from the government, but to see the free market also potentially add pressure to Russia and pressure for a change of behavior is definitely, I mean, that's going to be a story to definitely watch. I was looking at this quote from a maritime security company, a man that works for a maritime security company. And he said this: the sailors that he's talking about in the particular area of Ukraine, the sailors now face a stark choice: stay and risk running out of food and becoming collateral damage, or try to sail to freedom and risk hitting a seaborne mine. I mean, what do you make of that choice, Sal? How do we even weigh that choice?
Yeah, it's a tough choice. I personally don't think the ships are going to sail. I think the crews will get off before. The problem you have is some of the ships now are behind Russian lines, so that when they grab the port of Kherson, for example, this city of Kherson, which is along the coast, they captured several vessels when they did that. And so what has happened to the crews, we don't know yet. We don't know. You really can't take the risk of sailing, because not only do you have to run past Ukrainian mines, but then you got to run past the Russian Navy. And there's no telling how the Russian Navy would react to a ship sailing out. I mean, they've been basically shooting first, ask questions later. So, I mean, the crews are going to have to really abandon it. And this is also part of that international shipping thing. You know, back when you had Americans sailing American ships, now you have, you know, Filipinos, Ukrainians, Indonesians, Indians, Chinese sailing these vessels. They don't have an allegiance to the ships. They're it's a job, you know. Or are you willing to die for your business you work for, you know, or are you gonna, like, no, I'm gonna go home? And that's what's gonna happen here. I think they're gonna try to get out. The problem is, of course, as Ukraine falls more and more under Russian control, it's much more difficult to get out. But the shutdown of the ports, I mean, these vessels will be stuck in the port. And what's worse, if these vessels are sunk in the port, that can effectively close ports off. This would absolutely cut Ukraine off from the outside world. I mean, Ukraine, this is the way they communicate. This is the way they get goods out. And if these vessels sink in their major ports, block the ports, this is months, if not years of cleanup before they can get back to normal trade.
I didn't even think about that. In the reports that we've read about this topic, and we've talked about the Bangladeshi sailor, the crew member that was killed, the way it was reported is that he went out on a deck, and you probably could describe it better, Sal, and he was talking to his family in Bangladesh, who was worried about him.
Yep, he was up on the bridge, up on the very top where he got hit. He's an engineer, not usually up on the bridge, but he was where he can get cell phone communication. And that's the highest point on the ship.
And that just hit home with me, because everyone's just trying to communicate with their family. Everyone thinks they're somewhat removed from this. And here he lost his life, and and his family's in a country so far away. And so I really it's just a terrible thing to read about.
I joked at the beginning about, coming down with the condition and not sailing anymore. But for a lot of these mariners, this is an opportunity for them that they don't get at home where they live. They can go to sea for 2 to 4 months, even 6 months at a time, and make more money doing this than they can at home. And they can support not just themselves and their families. So they're willing to take that and go do that. And it's been extremely hard during the COVID. Understand, there's 1.8 million mariners who sail the vessels that move commerce. During COVID, when everybody went home and things shut down, shipping didn't stop. They kept moving. And a lot of them couldn't get off. I mean, you couldn't, fly back home to Bangladesh because, again, who's going to allow you off into into a harbor to go to an airport? It didn't happen. And so where you would normally be on for 2, 4, 6 months, some of these people were on for over a year. And I got to tell you, working at a place for a year nonstop every day is absolutely mind-numbing after a while. They've already been under huge amounts of pressure, and the Black Sea isn't closed. We still see ships going in. The port of Novorossiysk, which is a major Russian port, still has vessels heading into it. It's the terminus for a large pipeline that comes out of Central Asia. It's not just Russian oil coming out of that port. It's Kazakhstan, it's Georgia, it's Azerbaijan. It's all these little countries need to get their oil out. But at the same time, grain needs to come out, and you need to feed the rest of the world. So Russian grain is still coming out too. We haven't seen sanctions against that yet. We've seen sanctions against Russian oil, but not their food yet.
Very interesting. And it gives us an idea of the constellation of how shipping impacts the entire world. And maybe this is a good point to end on, Sal. How does the situation in Ukraine, how does it have the potential when we're looking at shipping in particular, how does it have the potential to impact your average American family living in Ohio or Nebraska or Florida?
Sure. So one of the things I always say is one of the things we've seen continually throughout the supply chain crisis that we've been in is small little disruptions, small little kinks in the supply chain resonate down the whole supply chain. So, for example, if you just take 3% of the world's containers out of service, like we're doing right now, where we're stopping shipping to Russia, that's 3% of the world's container boxes. Those boxes were planned to be moved, offloaded, and then repacked and sent back out. They're gone now. Now, all of a sudden, they're gone. And that's going to have a disruption in how you move goods. Food, again, we're going to have to ship food to these areas where Ukrainian wheat and barley and corn are not going to go to, which is a great opportunity, but also, is it available? For example, while we're so fixated on the Black Sea in South America right now, there's a drought, so that food supply in South America is not coming out like it normally does. You can't get barges down rivers down to the Rio Plata to load bulk carriers with grain. This is going to impact that grain distribution going around the world. Vancouver in Canada had these massive floods a few months ago, and they still have not caught back up from the backlog. We have got jam ups on our West Coast ports that we can't get containers out. They just recently had to fly 3 747s loaded with potatoes to Japan so that McDonald's could sell small fries because they couldn't get those potatoes out on a ship. And every little thing, because we're such a tightly interconnected world and we're so used to our goods flowing without disruptions, what we've seen since really the spring of 2020 has been a nonstop progression of these events. And war is the most unpredictable of them all. Understand the potential here is that this could end tomorrow or it could expand. It could get worse. As you do these economic sanctions to Russia, there's no telling how Russia reacts to it. And lots of times, I mentioned to you before, no one really cares too much about commercial shipping, what happens to it. And that could be a target for the Russians down the road. So it's a lot of variables. And whenever you create variables and doubt in supply, you tend to cause things to get expensive, which translates to inflation and higher costs.
What are you going to be watching for next?
I'm really watching a couple of things right now, and it's really important to see whether or not the sanctions go against the grain ships, because the grain ships are the big ones coming out of Russia right now. Russia still, as I mentioned before, about 9% of the world's grain. Making sure those keep moving. Is there going to be a move to kind of literally blockade Russia the way they're blockading Ukraine? Is there a move to stop ships coming in out of Russian ports? That's going to be a very provocative move if that is done. I don't think it will be, but you don't know. But the big thing of these economic sanctions being done by these companies, how Russia reacts to it. The hope was to push the oligarchs to change Putin, but now this is going to affect the average everyday Russian. How does the average everyday Russian now react to it? And there's not a good track record for revolution in Russia. I'm sorry, I'm a historian, and I'm literally teaching World War I right now. And when you cause revolution in Russia, it tends not to go very well. And so, the impacts here, there's a lot of historical analogies that keep coming to my mind. Foreign fighters going to Ukraine, that's Spanish Civil War. What's happening in Russia right now is revolutionary. So there's a lot to watch. And the best thing I would tell everybody is get as much news as you can from diverse sources, and just pay attention, because this does affect us, even though it's half a world away and we don't think it does. It really does, as we're seeing right now at the gas pumps with Russian energy being cut out of the system.
Fascinating. Well, Sal, this has been really interesting. I very much appreciate it. I hope that we can have you back and we can dig deeper on some of those historic topics as well, because our audience, I love history, and it's the only way you can really understand the current news cycle is to have a little foundation under your feet about what happened in the past. So this has been really terrific. I really appreciate your time. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, Jen. I appreciate it.
Quick, concise, nonpartisan, smarter news, a refuge from the storm. I'm Jenna. Thank you for choosing smarter.